Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and my guest today is TrainmasterGT. Welcome.
Hello, Cade. Nice to meet, or I guess we've met before, but it's nice to see you on the podcast.
Yeah, it's nice to, connect in the digital space again. We did just get to see each other not too long ago in real life at CubeCon, but nice to keep the connections going.
Yes, I made so many great friends while I was there, and it's really nice to keep the connections alive so that the social relationships don't decay back into parasocial ones.
Yeah, as corny as it sounds, when people talk about, oh, well, it's all about the gathering. I think it really is. We spend a lot of time diving into all of these things from maybe a heady perspective sometime or a kind of a flavorful angle, but then at the core of it, it's just getting to spend time with people we care about.
Oh, I agree. It's a way different experience actually spending time with people in person, even people you've known for like half a decade or more online. Just being with them in real life is such a game changer.
And also people getting to actually play the cubes that we've spent all the the mental energy into putting together.
Yeah, that's a big one too.
So, Trainmaster has put together several cubes, but the one that we got to experience most recently here is the Highball 4K. Would you give us the overview for that project?
All right, so Highball 4K is a 348 card cube designed to capture the experience of playing constructed in the mid 2010s. The environment is efficient and low curving, but it still allows for decks of various speeds to shine. Most are designed to compete on the tempo, value, or board control bases, so there aren't a lot of like weird stack based spell combo decks. In fact, I don't think there are any at this point in time. And the main goal is just kind of combine classic cards from when I was a kid with more recent cards that I have really come to enjoy. Most of them are from like the Theros Khan's standard time period, since that was when I was first getting into the game. So you got cards like Siege Rhino, Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, and Monastery Swiftspear. But then we're also playing with new cards that kind of play into the same mechanical themes and archetypes I'm trying to push, like Primordial Mist, Fable the Mirror Breaker, and Murktide Regent. So it's just a lot of fun cards and a lot of archetypes that I really enjoyed. Now, one thing I will say really quickly here is that this is not meant to be like a Museum of Magic cube. So I think a lot of cubes are playing in like a similar, like, let's play with nostalgic cards and archetypes space, are trying to like just display the older cards. Whereas the goal here is really just create the best gameplay experience possible. So I really want to maximize the value that I'm getting out of these older cards and also maximize the fun potential with the newer things. So that does lead us in kind of different directions than you might expect with other cubes like this, but I am sure we will get to that as we continue here.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that, and we'll spend some time on several of those ideas. I was gonna say you can't see me nodding along the way when you mention the Siege Rhino, or like as I've looked through the list, things like Pelucranos the World Eater. I was right around the era that I started playing, so this hits me square in the forehead of nostalgia in many ways. I wanted to ask, where did the name come from?
Okay, so if you can't tell from the username, I really like trains. When I was thinking of ways that I could kind of like just give my cube an interesting title, I was looking at like a couple of different things. Number one, I was a Boy Scout when I was a teenager. Technically, I started as one when I was 6, but one of the first places I had built the cube for was for my scouting community. And I was just like, okay, well, I either want to name the cube after like different scouting ranks, awards, merit badges, that sort of thing, or I want to name it after train stuff. So I did a little, I did a little like straw poll with people on the Riptide Lab cube forums. Like this was pre-Discord for me, so we're getting back into the old days,
Oh yeah,
and like doing the train names, even without the context of what the name would be, far and away got more votes. And I was just like, all right, yeah, we're going to lean into the train thing. So then the name I picked at first was just Highball. On railroading, when you're doing a highball, that's when you're just opening up your locomotive's throttle and letting it go as fast as you can. You're just going. The 4K came a little bit later after I'd been working on the cube for about 2 years. I kind of rebuilt it more into the version that we see now. And I was just like, all right, this is supposed to be like the definitive version of the cube. So we're going to pick my favorite train to be the title. And it just so happens that like my favorite locomotive is the Union Pacific 4000 series Big Boy. Originally, they were going to be called the Wasatches, oddly enough, like the mountain range. But then somebody at the locomotive works uh, chalked the word Big Boy onto the front of the boiler. And they actually just restored one of the Big Boys a few years ago. And when it was on its first tour, they redid the chalk with the word Big Boy on it again. So that was very funny to see.
I love how powerful that is that you can just, like, etch something in the front of a train and that just becomes what it's called.
Yeah, much to the chagrin of marketing too. That's the real funny part here is that the marketing team got undercut by just some random, not even like locomotive driving engineer, like just some mechanical engineer at some locomotive shop halfway across the country from where their trains would even be running.
That's amazing. Okay, so we have our Union Pacific Big Boy that gives us our 4K that becomes the tag to show, "Hey, we've updated to catch up with the recent years."
Yep.
That's excellent. I feel like I've already learned so much, and I feel like I'm now supposed to have a favorite train that I can't conjure.
Well, that's the great part about trains is you can just kind of like look at one and say, "This is my favorite now."
Well, it sounds like for the moment, my favorite is, the Union Pacific Big Boy, and I'm gonna go do some research after we're done here. So thinking about the construction of Highball 4K, why 384 cards? Because that's not a traditional number there.
Yeah, so I think the answer is actually pretty simple. When you do 384 cards, it lets you do 16 card packs. So each pack will wheel twice. So that way you don't really have to do the math of like, oh, am I going to see this pack again? Or is this one of the ones that I won't get a wheel out of? It's like, nope. If you see a booster pack in front of you, you will be getting the wheel at some point.
Do you find that your players respond well to that? Has it impacted the draft a whole lot?
I feel like the biggest change for me has personally been the just the fact that I get the 24 extra cards to work with. I think the impact on the draft has not been as large as I would have initially expected, but I do think it's nice because it gives you the best of having that 360 small cube. You get to have the whole cube drafted the entire time, and like the extra little bit of flexibility with slots that you get from the larger size. I was definitely expecting it to be a big change for players specifically, but I would say the impact has been less noticeable than I would have initially thought.
I think something that may go along with this. Let's take a moment to talk about your basic land box, or should I just say the land box?
Yeah, of course.
For clarity, there's a special rule here, right? I don't want to bury the lead.
Yeah, so the difference between a normal basic land box and my quote unquote basic land box is that I run copies of the tapped dual lands. I think in the primer it says they're the Dominaria United ones, but they're actually the snow ones right now from Call Time. They're just lands with two basic land types that enter the battlefield tapped. And then I also have the indestructible bridges from Modern Horizons 2. Same thing, they have two colors, they're artifacts, and they enter the battlefield tapped, but they're also indestructible. Now, the idea for these kind of came at two separate times. For the tap snow slash Dominaria dual lands, those I wanted to add just as a way to make sure that my fetch lands were always able to grab some sort of like multi type land for different decks. I was finding that there was a huge incentive to like eat up all the shock lands during the drafts just because they would pair so well with the fetch lands. And rather than just like adding a bunch of more shock lands, I was just like, I think a lot of the value that is coming from these cards is just the fact that you can get your extra types online for your fetches. And I just thought, I would rather make it so that you can take a cooler card you want to play over a shock land just to make sure your fetch land is good. So that's why I added those to the land box. And then the indestructible lands came about when I was trying to add one of my archetypes to the cube. I really wanted to do an Ensoul artifact deck, basically a deck where you get these like cards like the titular Ensoul artifact, which is an enchantment that will make one of your artifacts a 5/5 creature. And in standard, that would get played alongside Darksteel Citadel,
Oh
which is
yeah.
just an indestructible land. So you'd be able to get a 5/5 with indestructible on turn two. That was very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with. I added some other support for that, like Tezzeret Betrayer of Flesh and the Black Staff of Waterdeep, which are both repeatable versions of that effect, although they only make them 4/4s. And then I also added the new Zoetic Glyph from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which is 3 mana and makes the creature a 5/4. But then if the glyph ever gets removed, it lets you discover 3, so it lets you just get another card with mana value 3 or less out of your deck. Randomly off the top, I should clarify there for people who've never seen a discover card before. And those kind of came about after the tapped dual lands, just because I was like, okay, well, these other cards have not been as overpowered as I may have expected. They're actually just about as good as a basic land. So I'll just try these other things to help make this Ensoul plan work the way I wanted it to.
Do you have a limit as to how many of these lands players can get out of the box?
Originally, I had the limit as like 4 of the tapped dual lands and 2 of the bridges. That was only because that was what I like had. They gave me a bunch of extras at CubeCon, so I might be removing the cap from those. The thing is, like, I do not think the tapped dual lands are actually that good unless you like really need them for your deck. There's such a potential tempo loss from just getting your land to enter tapped that I think in a lot of cases they're not really better than a basic land. They're just sort of like your last ditch, get my fixing online, make sure my fetch land is able to do the thing that you want your fetch lands to do. I would need to do more testing with that, I think, because I've only personally had a few drafts, so I've played with them. But like, I do not think a mana base of 17 of these tapped lands would be any good.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know that you want all of them to be there. I was wondering if having that much as an option to use pushed people toward more colors than they would normally play, like you'd see more 3 and 4 color or more decks.
Yeah, so I haven't really seen that in a lot of cases. So I think 5 color is like actively pretty bad in this cube, even with, the 60 fixing lands in the main cube and all of the extra cards. The thing is, this is a very like synergy oriented environment. Even though it kind of looks like a more generic legacy-ish type of cube, a lot of the decks are really focused on getting a specific plan in motion and trying to execute on that plan. So, like, for example, if you're playing a Soul Tie deck, you're probably going to be doing some, like, sort of graveyard plan. You're going to be using your Thought Scours as, like, mini dark rituals that also cantrip to power up your delve spells, okay? Well, if you just decide you want to, like, add white to your Soul Tie deck, you're not necessarily going to be getting a lot of value out of having that extra color because the things that like white is doing really don't mesh all that well with the soul tie delve plan specifically. That's not to say that there isn't like interaction between white black, black green, blue white. Like all these color combinations still work, but they're not necessarily doing the same thing in the same way. And as such, it results in these situations where it's like, well, I could be splashing this extra color, but if I want to go full on the splash, it's just not going to make my deck better.
That's interesting. So, like, the themes are louder than, like, the potential power gain from a splash like that.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a good opportunity to mention also, you break singleton in a couple of places, and often when I suggest that, usually that means, hey, you have 1 extra of something, but it looks like you've gone up to triplicate on a couple of things as well.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about like constructed gameplay, there are usually some individual cards that decks tend to revolve around. So, like in Modern, one of the really popular ones before it was banned was Faithful Suiting. There was an entire like subcategory of decks where their entire thing was I am playing multiple copies of Faithful Suiting. I'm using it to both filter me to my cards that I really need, and then it's also allowing me to like set up these cool graveyard synergies, like turn 1 Faithful Suiting, discard a Lingering Souls, turn 2 cast Lingering Souls, or like turn 1 draw discard, like get a Grizzlebrand in your graveyard and then Goryo's Vengeance it. There are all these different things that you could do with Faithful Suiting that were just like really powerful and cool. Well, if you want to do Faithful Suiting decks in your cube, if you're singleton, you only get the 1 copy of Faithful Suiting. There are no other cards, at least in mono red, that do the same thing as Faithful Suiting as well as Faithful Suiting. So if you want a deck like that, you really just either have to hope that your players can get by with the 1 copy of Faithful Suiting, play the worst versions that don't really do the same thing at all, or just play extra Faithful Suitings. And as soon as I realized that, it kind of opened up new doors to a lot of different decks. Like earlier, I mentioned Thought Scour and how that card can just kind of be like a mini Dark Ritual that also cantrips if you're playing a deck with a bunch of Delve spells. Well, I play a few different decks where like getting cards into your graveyard is relevant. Obviously, there's the aforementioned like quote unquote Delve archetype, but there's also like some decks that are focused on getting lots of like different card types into your graveyard for like enabling Delirium or making your Tarmogoyf bigger. And in all these instances, you want to be able to mill yourself. So I just added 2 extra copies of Thought Scour, and that's really helped power up those decks. I wanted to give green the option to like get some more instants and sorceries, so I played copies of Abundant Harvest, which again, it really helps smooth out your draws by just giving you that option to like pick a land or a non-land card off the top at random. But it also just is like these extra card types. It gives you synergy with your prowess things, and it can even kind of power up your delve spells, albeit not as well as the Thought Scour, just by getting a thing in your graveyard for 1 mana. There's Unearth. Unearth, I wanted to have like a young pyromancer slash monastery mentor deck, and Unearth is a really good way to help get those back. It also lets you trigger your pyromancers and your mentors. I'm playing the Sedgemoor Witch from that more recent set, Strixhaven as well.
Strixhaven, yeah. You don't have to work very hard to sell me on Unearth. It's one of my very favorite effects.
Yeah, from what I've learned, a lot of cubers really like Unearth. For a little while, I was actually playing No One Left Behind 2, which is a 5 mana reanimation spell that costs 3 less to cast if you are targeting a creature with mana value 3 or less. I ended up needing to cut it in order to make room for something else, but I was playing that for a little while and it was kind of cool.
It wouldn't shock anyone to think that cube designers tend to like versatility in designs. So something like Unearth that has this functionality that makes you consider deck building in a different way with the cap on mana value, but then also just has the cycling mode. Like,
Yeah.
I know it's kind of cheating to throw cycling on something and be like, well, yeah, it's obviously going to be valuable. But here in particular, it has such a specific and critical use case, but also has a valve in case you can't do that.
Yeah, and, like, I also find that it has gone into more decks than I was expecting. Like, it is there for that Mardu Pyromancer Unearth plan, but I've also seen it, like, you can just, like, get a Grist the Hunger Tide back with Unearth. That's a thing you can do with that card.
Sure
You can get a
can.
card back with it if you are in a situation where you have a Tarmogoyf in your graveyard because your opponent, like, Fatal Pushed or whatever, like, that's a thing you can do with Unearth. You like Adeline and Brimaz? Unearth has got Adeline and Brimaz out of your graveyard for you. So there's a lot of these like weird cases where it's like, well, these weren't necessarily the things I was supporting with Unearth, but Unearth just does it because Unearth is a cool card.
Definitely covers a lot of bases. I didn't see which one on white. Do you have any in white that are three?
Yeah, so with white, I was never able to find like a card that just really spoke to me enough to be like, this is the card that I need 3 copies of to build around. I did end up doing 2 copies of Helping Hand, which has been a really nice card. It's basically Unearth without the cycling. And since White Black is one of the angles you can build that Unearth deck from, I put in Helping Hand, but it's not as good as Unearth, and it's not really like the card that's going to be the anchor for your deck. So while I wanted that effect there in white, it's not one that needs 3 ofs. I think there was one other white card that I had multiples of.
It's the Loam Lion.
Oh yeah, Loam Lion, that's a zoo card. So I've got 2 of each of the zoo 1 drops. So 2 Loam
Oh
Lions, 2 Curt
yeah.
Apes, and well in the Coddles. Not sure those are going to stay around forever because I've been having trouble getting zoo to be as powerful as I want. But yeah, like I think 3 Loam Lions would be an overkill. White is just in a position where it has enough redundancy with individual cards where I don't really need to play multiples in order to get where I need my white section to be.
One of the things you discussed in your overview, which great overview that covers a whole lot of things in depth if folks are interested that direction. But one of the things you talk about there is that you're attempting to duplicate enablers rather than payoffs. And I thought that was a really great concept. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the great things about Cube, I feel, is that you get this diversity of gameplay. You can play so many different options for decks. There's a lot of different unique cards. And I think it's one of the few formats that can both have that constructed feel while still giving you that option to like explore, all while still like quote unquote spiking the cube. Like if your goal is to win, you can still have all these fun situations that you're exploring in Cube. So I thought it would be interesting if rather than putting in a bunch of copies of like the Siege Rhinos or the Tarmogoyfs or the Monastery Swift Spears and Mentors, if I just made it easier to find those individual cards if you have them, and then include other cards that have a similar role in the deck, but maybe have different options and different play patterns. So, like for example, maybe rather than playing like 3 Swift Spears, you get your 1 Swift Spear, your 1 Dragon Rage Channeler, and then your one
Probably Soulscar Mage.
yeah, Soul Skirmish. Let's go with that one. All 3 of these cards go into the same shell. They have a lot of the same basic synergies, but they do different things, and they can also be used in different contexts. So, like for example, if you're playing a more red-heavy deck and you have Soulscar Mage, well, now you've already got this like hidden mode of like putting -1/-1 counters on things to shrink your opponent's creatures. which doesn't like happen with your Swift Spear or your Dragon Rage Channeler. If you're playing a Dragon Rage Channeler deck, maybe you can like put it into a more red-green base shell and use it as like a second weird evasive Tarmogoyf that also helps you set up your future draws. And then Swift Spear, obviously, that's like the one of the greatest of all time red one drops, which is like, yep, I've got my little guy.
Little guys.
I'm gonna consider Ponder Lightning Bolt. Now it's a 4/5. Deal with it. That sort of thing. And I like having that extra flexibility in those slots. I feel like a lot of what makes this cube unique would be lost if I was just doing like multiple copies of the same threats. Another card that actually I think really illustrates this is I used to be playing 3 copies of Inquisition of Kozilek just because the 1 mana discard is like so important for a lot of different black decks.
It was really emblematic of the play patterns of that time as well.
Yeah, but I found like when you had a deck that had triple Inquisition, you were getting Inquisition of Kozilek basically every single game on turn one, it felt like. 3 Inquisitions in a 40 card deck is actually like you have a higher likelihood of drawing an Inquisition turn one than if you have 4 copies in a 60 card deck. It's just super annoying. So I actually ended up having to cut one of the Inquisitions in order to get the gameplay feel back to where I wanted it. If you're losing to the same threat over and over again, or in the case of Inquisition, like proactive interaction, it just can be very annoying. So it's just nice to have those like different things that can kill you to make the games feel different, even if everything's kind of going in the same basic shell.
And I really like what that looks like in execution too. Or as you described, you're not just losing to somebody having 2 or 3 siege rhinos, which is pretty brutal, but you have ways to cast creatures like or threats like siege rhino.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes this cube a little bit more unique compared to some of the like other more nostalgia-driven cubes, is that there's a more diverse range of threats to enjoy that are all kind of a similar-ish power level. So you've got all these fun options. You've got all these different directions you can go in the draft process, and it's kind of about like tailoring your deck to what you want to do and how you want to play the game and how you want to experience the format.
So thinking of creatures like siege rhino that are, oh boy, at time of recording coming up on 10 years old. How do
Yep.
you find the balance between this cube being an homage to past constructed environments and it being an ever shifting environment?
So when I'm thinking about like cards that I want to include, I think the first thing I have to think of like, is this card fun to play with? Because I think that really dictates a lot of whether or not I want to put the card in the cube or not. One of my main goals with this cube, and I would actually say my main goal here, is to just give people the ability to experience Magic in the way it felt to me when I was first starting to get in the game around that 2014-15 time period. So I've kind of been selecting specifically archetypes that play into that feel. So when I'm picking cards, one of the things I'm really thinking about is this card playing into the themes I want? For example, one of the more recent cards that I've included in the cube is Murktide Regent. It's just a really big delve creature. I think it's like a 7 mana 3/3, but then it enters with +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of like instant sorcery cards you exiled while you were casting it.
Almost never a 3/3, but yeah, the number of instant sorceries you delve away.
Well, especially in the decks that would be playing Murktide Regent.
Right.
It's hard with a cons blot mechanic. It has delve. It is a dragon. Specifically, it's like the picture in the art is one of the dragons from Silumgar's Brood, and it plays into a couple of the different decks I'm trying to push. Like, for example, the blue-red, quote-unquote, cruise control tempo archetype that was played for like the 3 months while Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time were legal in Modern.
Yeah, that was a really short window, wasn't it?
Yeah, those cards are, like, kind of overpowered, it's like, that's an understatement, but
Yeah.
regardless, very powerful Magic, and I think Murktide Regent does a good job of feeling like a card that could have been from Khans block, while also just existing in this newer space and doing something a little bit different from the older cards in a way that I think enhances the experience. Now, I will say, like, on power level, originally my goal was to pick cards that were, like, not going to be better than your Siege Rhino or your Pelucranos or your I would say Mantis Rider, but honestly, Mantis Rider, every single time I play with that card, I am just so impressed by it. Like, just as a generic card, it really does hang with a lot of the new things, I think, which is so funny to think about because it has not seen a lot of play in Eternal formats in a little while. But regardless, good card there.
Well, yeah, it's like coming from Lightning Angel before it to Mantis Rider. Turns out flying and haste are still just powerful keywords together.
Yeah, especially when you add vigilance into it and you also get
Right.
to block it. But yeah, so I was originally trying to focus on keeping a lot of the new cards less powerful than like specifically Siege Rhino and Pelucranos. When I was first coming up with an earlier version of this cube, I was building with what I called the Thanos approach because I was an edgy 16-year-old and the Thanos memes were all over. And the whole idea was like you were trying to perfectly balance your format as all things should be.
I thought you were gonna say you got rid of half of it at a time.
That would be very funny too, but no, it was the perfectly balanced as all things should be.
That's right, that's right.
My whole concept was, all right, I've got these cards that I'm calling format barometers. Basically, I want these to be the cards that are like the best things in the format. And this was actually a little bit before I had switched to like the Theros Cons nostalgia-ish direction. This was more of like just a medium power Riptide Lab average synergy cube type thing. But I just wanted to play Pelucranos because Pelucranos was cool. And what I kind of realized eventually is like Pelucranos is a good magic card, but there are a lot of things that are just like more powerful than Pelucranos that don't invalidate it, but are like just as fun or add a little bit more fun to the format. So like the big one I like to think of right now is Essica's Chariot, which is the 4/4 vehicle with crew 4. When it enters, you make two cats, and then whenever the chariot attacks, you can like copy a token. That card I think is probably my best 4 drop in the cube. And like I don't love the fact that it's not a cons block creature, but it just gets bodied by both the cards we were talking about earlier. Like if you have a Siege Rhino, you do not need to worry about the Essica's Chariot attacking you. You just block it and kill it. Womp womp. Like, okay, yes, they got an extra cat, but like hopefully you have the tools to deal with those some other way.
Pelucranos can fight your tokens.
Right. Yeah, it's I think a little bit better in a vacuum, but it's not like it invalidates these other cards existing. If you're on the other side of a chariot and you're playing one of the other cards I wanted to focus on, you just beat it because your 4 drops are just that little bit better against that one specific situation. I've still been waffling on a couple of these newer cards just because I don't necessarily want to take the focus away from the older things, but I'm also just trying to make the most fun environment I can. Ultimately, I don't want to build like a second legacy-ish expensive cards cube. Like if I were to build a second cube, I'd want to explore something entirely different. And by the very nature of this cube, focusing on like emulating gameplay from higher power level constructed formats, I can play higher power level constructed cards here without ruining the feel.
By way of the power of this environment, how have you felt that Fable of the Mirror Breaker fits in here?
Okay, so Fable of the Mirror Breaker, I think, is like exactly the type of card for this type of cube. And I know that may seem very weird because I think Fable has earned this reputation as being like an incredibly strong card. It's very 2022 coded. It does all these different things, does all these different words, all these different abilities. But I think what people miss about Fable is a couple of things. Number one, Fable the Mirror Breaker is designed to emulate the story of a card that was very popular in the era I'm talking about. Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker was like one of the iconic cards when I was first getting into Magic. The fact that it was this cool legendary creature that could go infinite with a bunch of other things was just very awesome. And what Fable does is it actually tells Kiki Jiki's origin story, like how I think he like stole a mirror or something and then broke it and got the ability to like clone himself, but he was also like friends with a dragon in there somewhere. It's been a while since I've read Kiki's story, but in either case, like the card is just telling the story of Kiki Jiki. And like even the last chapter, like I think the goblin token you make at the beginning is supposed to be Kiki, but then the creature you get on the backside at the end is like the first reflection from when he breaks the mirror, which is just like it's so cool. It's such a flavorful card. And that's actually one of the reasons why I play sagas. Again, I want to keep the mechanics mostly feeling similar to those older Theros Cons mechanics. So I haven't really ended up playing things like dungeons or more recently the room cards. I tested a bunch of battles, but I ended up cutting them before CubeCon just because of the whole double faced thing. There were a lot of newer mechanics like that, which I just don't really play. Mutate, I hate Mutate, just no. Um, Sagas, because they're telling the stories of these older cards, especially the ones from like Dominaria and Theros and now Neon Dynasty, like they really are showcasing the history of Magic. And I think this type of cube where I'm trying to kind of like tell the story of my childhood Magic experience, these cards are perfect. The second point for Fable now is that the card just enables so many different things. Now, I know that a lot of people have kind of this thing with Fable where it's like, okay, well, it does a lot of things, but it just gives you so much value that it kind of invalidates that. The thing is, though, all the things that Fable does in this cube are relevant to the different synergy decks. So it's like whether you're making the treasures from the Goblin token and then copying one of your like ensouled artifact creatures and just like I'm not exactly sure how the rules on like copying the enchanted things work, but like still, you can like copy your Vault Scourge for the turn and get a second Vault Scourge. And that's pretty fun. Or you can like copy something entirely different, like copy a chariot, get more cats, and laugh in your opponent's face because you've got all these cats now. Actually, my use wolf tokens, and I've got a custom wolf that is like the Doge of Venice, but as like the Doge James dog, which is like the Shiba. So it's very funny.
Excellent.
Um, because creature types don't matter in this cube.
Quick aside to glance into the camera here to say that if you copy something that has been turned into a creature, you're only going to get the card before it was animated. So, say you are duplicating an ensouled card, you're going to end up with like just the Dark Steel Citadel underneath it. But Vault Scourge is a good target for this.
Yeah, but that's pretty fun. You just get an extra 1/1 lifelinker for a turn. Or you can like copy your hangerback walker and immediately have something die in the event that you need to like cast Fatal Push in a pinch or something. Like that's there's all these funny edge cases with it.
Sure. Or Siege Rhino.
Or Siege Rhino, yes. Just that's one of the examples that I like to give. And for some reason in this conversation, I just forgot to say like, oh yeah, just copy your Siege Rhino. I guess it kind of goes back to that like 5-color pile being kind of bad thing. So the reality is like even though Fable is this like pile of value, each valuable part still has all of these different potential interactions that you can do with it. And I would just say, I guess that's really the last point with Fable. It just enables red mid-range decks all by itself. I think a lot of the red mid-range cards are newer in general, and if you want to focus more on like playing things like the different burn decks from the time period or like prowess, there's just not a lot of space for like random red cards that don't really play well into those themes. So by having this card that ties in with a lot of the different themes I'm looking at, while also just being one of the best mid-range enablers in the game right now, it's just a really good fit.
I want to anchor right quickly on one of the things you said there. You talked about designing at one time with a sense of a format barometer. Do the cards that you use that way, have those stayed the same throughout or have those adjusted over time?
Yeah, so I would say that for a while I kind of just abandoned the concept because I was just more interested in getting the feel. The idea with barometers was just like I wanted to keep the power level fairly consistent. But over time, what I realized is like really my goal here is just capture that feel from when I was younger with the rose colored glasses and all. I'm not trying to recreate some of the famous board stalls that you'd get where it's like you've got three horrible on a siege rhino and you're just hoping you draw your stoke the flames before they draw the second siege rhino. That was not fun Magic in my opinion. And even to this day, like I do not like board stall games. So for me, it's just like, okay, how do I cut down on these different issues that I find? And sometimes that just means like you have to play cards that are maybe more powerful than you would normally want for something like this. A really good example is like Kappa Cannoneer. That card really helps you push through as the artifact player because you can just like make your thing unblockable for the turn and it's really big. It kind of fills the role of like your Mirror Enforcer type of card. It's just a lot better than Mirror Enforcer, and it's a card that gives you a reason to play artifacts rather than being like a reward for playing artifacts. So even though it maybe is like a little bit more push than you'd want for something trying to emulate the time period card pool wise, it does exactly what I needed gameplay wise in order to see the outcomes that I was looking for. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I like that example too. I found that in one of my own projects that I had a similar outlier in a card like Chrome Host Seed Shark that while it may be a bump or a spike in the rough power level, it was something that drew people into playing a particular way or in a particular style. And it sounds like that's what something like Kappa Cannoneer is doing here for you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, when figuring out what I want to play and what I want to cut, A lot of it is really just seeing, like, does this card have the gameplay outcomes I want? Ultimately, the end goal here is gameplay. So there are some cards that are unlikely to ever be cut, like Siege Rhino or Monastery Mentor or Monastery Swiftspear or Tarmogoyf. For any of those guys, that like these things are not set in stone. And I used to be playing cards like Boon Satyr, which is a 3 mana 4/2 with flash that you can bestow for 5 mana to give the enchanted creature +4/+2.
You can't see me nodding. I have resolved many a boon satyr.
That card just didn't do what I needed it to do. It didn't really contribute to the feel. Like, yeah, okay, it was there. It saw a little bit of play in like 2014 standard, but it wasn't like a good card. It was just always kind of fine. And I just needed like more powerful cards to help the different mid-range decks kind of push through. Boon Satyr wasn't it, so it got the axe, went away, and I replaced it with. Honestly, it's been long enough since I replaced Boon Satyr that I could not tell you what I replaced it with.
And then finding those things that, as you've already described with some of your other choices, that are synergizing with the play patterns that you want, that are pushing particular decks or themes or flavors.
Yeah, yeah. Like Neoshiba Brawler, for example. It's a card from Dominator United. It's 2 mana for a star 3 cat with trample. Its power is equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control. Okay, well, that's a great zoo card. It's probably just a Watch Wolf at your floor, but maybe sometimes you have like the extra Triome and you just have like a 4/3 or a 5/3 for 2, which is a really good payoff for those sorts of decks. And it helps you push through the siege rhinos and Plukeroses of the world that Zoo may sometimes have trouble dealing with without a removal spell.
So, Train Master, shall we talk trains for just a quick moment more?
Yeah.
In your overview, you have this beautiful reference. Tell us about the Talyllyn Railway and how that relates to your cube.
Okay, so the Talyllyn Railway is this little narrow gauge short line in Wales, and it was originally designed to take slate from some of the different quarries out to kind of this like transport hub slash port city called Tywin, like the Lannisters for my George R. R. Martin's fans. In around the 1950s, they decided that they were going to preserve the railroad as a shoreline. This is around the time when there was this really big movement to preserve railway history in the United Kingdom as a whole, and Wales was no exception to this. So they started refurbishing a bunch of the older locomotives. I think the first one was actually an import from a different railroad, and they started running passenger trains. The railroad's been running for the last 70 years, ever since they started doing that stuff in the 1950s, and they've been taking passengers to and from ever since. In the 1970s, they actually extended it from one of the former mineral lines all the way to a new station, and they also rebuilt some of the stuff around Tywin. But throughout the entire history of the railroad, they were going through and they were updating the experience. They added electronic signaling in the 1970s. They've updated the coaches that they used several times. They've added trains that never even ran on the Talyllyn Railroad, or rather locomotives, like locomotives that were originally from different companies. But all the while, they have been running this authentic railroading experience that still gives people the feeling of stepping back in time to when this was a slate quarry train, and really getting to enjoy the Welsh countryside. And I think that kind of is a lot of what I wanted to do with this cube. Basically, I want to give people the ability to experience magic the way that I got to experience it when I was a young boy. I was around like between 11 and 13 during the Theros Cons era. I think for a lot of Magic players, those, like, if you were playing as a teenager, or even in my case, like a tween, those years are going to be some of your like formative experiences as a Magic player. And I think those will kind of like dictate what you like in the future in some regard, or at the very least, what you don't like in the future. And what I kind of realized was, it's like, I want to share this experience with other people in the same way that the good folks at the Talyllyn Railway have shared the experience of riding the Welsh narrow gauge with their passengers for the last 70 years.
I like that a lot. It just the sense of it's not locking in this moment of history. It's not like you're not making any improvements, but the feeling, like you've described, is the thing you want to champion most. And so then the changes you make are equipping that or like making that possible.
Exactly. One of the things you may have noticed is that a lot of the newer cards that we've been talking about in this conversation have been cards that were printed like roughly between Modern Horizons 2 and Streets of New Capenna. And that's no accident. that time period is probably the era of Magic that I'm like the second most nostalgic for of any time in Magic's history. And even though I'm not really trying to replicate any of the constructed formats from that time period, there are a lot of individual cards from back then that I love and I want to play with. Fable's one of those cards. I started playing Fable in Cube way before it ever ended up being a constructed staple. Same thing with Chariot, although to a slightly lesser extent. That one I just picked up because it was like a good Cube card, and then I just kind of never cut it, and I have still continued to enjoy it, especially as being like an artifact has become more relevant. Murktide Regent, another one. I remember when that card was spoiled. It was right around the time I was reconstructing this cube from like the older mid power synergy cube into like the more constructed oriented version of the cube. And I just remember being there like, yes, this card is perfect. It is just, it emanates this like Con Zero energy. But since then, Murktide has become like its own thing. People don't tie Murktide as like this 2014 nostalgia card. Like it's its own thing that some people will complain about to no end for how good it is in modern. Regardless, it's a fun card to have around. And I think that as that time period grows further away from us, it's still something that I wish to continue to hold on to and cherish. I was having some tough times in my life back then, and it was nice to like have that fun Magic the Gathering experience to kind of like help me power through and get out to the other side here where we are today. And I think that getting to experience those has been a really fun part of the cube for me.
And you get to keep sharing it with others too.
Exactly. Yeah. Seeing the cards from Theros Beyond Death when that was being spoiled was one of the things that made me realize, oh yeah, actually I want to go this more nostalgia direction, because a lot of the Beyond Death cards are things that just like tied really well into the themes of both the Theros block but also the Cons block. Like Escape is kind of like you can cast your cards from your graveyard as long as you're like delving away some things. And like the sagas were all stories from Theros block. It kind of felt like if you were to delete Born of the Gods and put um, Beyond Death at the end of Theros block, it turns the Greek tragedy into like more of a Greek comedy, which I thought was really interesting. Now, instead of Elspeth's tragic defeat at the hands of Heliod, now Heliod is getting banished to the underworld himself and like having to hold. I don't know if it's the sun that he's holding up or like the planet or something along those lines, but either way, he's going to be out of commission for a while, or at least that was the intention. And then he was just randomly free during the March of the Machines. But you know what? I don't know if a lore explanation was ever given for that, so we're not even going to talk about it.
So as you consider the Highball 4K, where it is now and where it's been, what advice would you give to other designers as they're considering their own projects?
I would just say, like, have a clear idea of what you want. I think the number one problem that a lot of designers have is they just like don't have that clear vision for their cube. And like I know that there's a lot of things going in my cube. I know like it's hard to describe all the different things that are trying to go on. But like fundamentally for me, this is just about like sharing that experience from when I was younger, and I'm doing it through a more like tempo oriented constructed format. That's kind of like the ultimate goal here. And then all the other things just kind of contribute to that. But it took me a long time to figure that out. I was cubing for almost half a decade before I realized that the thing that I was really looking for out of cube was just that like ability to share the things that I loved about Magic with my friends. Actually, if I did Mark Rosewater's like psychographic profile test, and it turned out that even though I enjoy more like spiky gameplay, I'm actually a quote unquote social gamer Timmy, which is just somebody who wants to experience like the gathering element of games and share that with their friends. At least as far as Magic is concerned. There are other games where I'm a total spike, but in Magic specifically, I am a social gamer Timmy. So I think just understanding those things about yourself and understanding those goals for your cube are very, very important to providing the cube experience that you want.
Well, Trainmaster GT, this has been an absolute pleasure. I feel like we've covered a whole lot of ground and really gotten to dive into some deep thoughts on this project of yours. As we're working here toward the end of our time together, I get to ask one of my favorite questions, which is if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would it be and who would you have do the illustration?
So I think there's kind of an obvious answer here, which would be Siege Rhino. But here's the thing. Siege Rhino actually doesn't need another promo. Base Siege Rhino art is perfect. But also, we have two really good pro arts. We like the Siege Rhino options that exist. So when I'm thinking about cards that, maybe actually need a promo version, one that really jumps out to me is actually Murktide Regent. It shows a Slimgar Brood Dragon. It's framed in such a way so it's like kind of an homage to the card Gadul Lurker from Dragons of Tarkir. So like I appreciate what's going on with the art, but it's not like anything special. So, what I would do with Murktide Regent is give it art either by Svetlin Velinov, who has done a bunch of really iconic dragons. He did Thundermaw Hellkite. He's done some different art of Nicol Bolas, including like I think he did like Apex of Power. So he's done a bunch of cool things. Most recently, he did the Chisgoria Forge Tyrant card, which is like one of the big affinity dragons. He has proven his ability to do Slumgar dragons. He did the art for Noxious Dragon from Fate Reforged, which is like one of Slumgar's smaller broodlings. But the other option actually is Stephen Belladin, who did the art for both Silumgar, the Drifting Death, and Dragonlord Slumgar. I would say Slumgar, the Drifting Death is probably the iconic Slumgar Brood dragon art. So I think that's pretty perfect. So if you were to do a promo of Murktide Regent, that would make the world a happier place. So you've got two great artists for a great card that's really in need of some new art.
And you've picked really a cast of all-stars here. Svetlin Belanov and Stephen Belden also covered a whole gamut of art in the game, so great choices.
Thank you.
If folks want to learn more about any of the projects you've worked on or want to follow up a little bit more on the Highball 4K, where would be the best place for us to point them?
So I would say the Riptide Lab cube form, that's always the first place I point people just because it gives you like a good written record. Otherwise, I'm in most of the major Cube Discords. So I'm like in Riptide Labs Cube Discord, obviously. I'm in the Cube Talk Discord. I'm also in the Cube Brainstorming Discord. I'm in the Cube Cobra Discord, CubeCon Discord. I would say like mainly Cube Tab, Riptide Lab, and the Brainstorming are the big ones. But like if I'm in a server that you're in, you want to at me, I'm TrainmasterGT or some variation of such on all of them. So, if you want to reach out, please feel free. That always makes me happy to see.
Well, again, Trainmaster GT, thank you so much for taking your time to walk us through this project, to share your passion for sharing it. It's really been a delight for me, and again, what a joy to connect after seeing you in person to then get to do this even further.
Yeah, I agree. I had such a great time talking about this with you today. I've really enjoyed all of our conversations that we've had so far, and it's been really nice to share my cube in depth and talk about it in a critical way, and hopefully share new things with new people.